So one of the important groups of people that we need to thank that makes the BSC and the small grants program possible is our advisory board. Our advisory board, Dr. Darieck Scott, Dr. Brandy Summers, Dr. Nikki Jones, Dr. Eula Taylor. Did I miss anybody? And Dr. Nadia Ellis, of course. We are really grateful for this brain trust and care trust who help us realize the vision of the BSC. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague and advisory board member, Dr. Darieck Scott, who is moderating the fifth panel of the day, Black Study.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy to be with you and to moderate this panel, Panel 5, Black Study. I'm just going to give the names and titles of the projects of the grantees first, and then ask the questions, and everybody can respond. First, we have with us Darius Gordon. The title of his project is Black and Indigenous Brazil, History, Culture, and Language as a Diasporic Bridge. We have Rachel Anspach, definition from above, the role of U.S. philanthropy in Black K-12 education. Wilson Wang, belabored bodies, Black corporeality and aesthetics, and toil in China. And Xavier Durham, when the police become police, the political economy of re-entry in California. So the first question I'm going to ask each of you is to briefly describe your project, what it was, what you accomplished.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Darius. For my small grant, I was fortunate enough to collaborate with Marcus Valois and Antonio Castro, who are the co-founders of the Araraquara Institute, a Portuguese language institute located in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Together, we co-designed and facilitated a 4-week public mini course entitled Black and Indigenous Brazil, History, Culture, and Language as a Diasporic Bridge. And so this course, like I said, was 4 weeks. Over the course of 4 weeks, me, the instructors, and our participants met over 8 one-hour sessions. The course itself was sort of motivated by 2 grounding ideas. The first one is we strongly believe that language learning can be a step toward transnational solidarity, and so we wanted to inspire our participants to think about how the act of learning a language can be a first step or a bridge toward understanding another struggle, another culture outside of the U.S. And the second grounding idea is that of Amafricanidade or Amafricanity, which is not only a through line for our course, but also a grounding tenet of the pedagogical practice of the Institute. And this concept of Africanity comes from the Black feminist Brazilian Leila Gonzalez, who is pictured up there next to Angela Davis. And this concept, in short, was her way of sort of theorizing race relationality across the Americas to sort of uplift the commonalities of our cultures of resistance, our political cultures, our linguistic practices, and how those practices were born out of both the sort of construction of a people through European settler colonial domination and a resistance to that domination. And so drawing on those 2 motivations, our goal for the course was to primarily introduce the Portuguese language to the participants, so some basic grammatical structure, some key vocabulary, and we used or grounded the introduction of the language in Black and Indigenous history, culture, and politics. The other main goal of the course was to, of course, further inspire folks to not only continue to learn the language, but to dive deeper into understanding Black and Indigenous Brazilian life and to ultimately build connections and to form bonds of solidarity. So my collaborators could not be here. They're in Rio de Janeiro. They send their regards and their thank you to the BSC for funding us. And they also put together a short video that'll play now.
In the big picture, what we have is an elite of a privileged few, united and willing to explore all the possibilities of having Black and Indigenous people fighting against each other. Divide to conquer is still the most effective way to guarantee domination upon land and people since colonial times.
The saying, war against the lords and peace between us, has to be taken in consideration by those who resist and fight the oppression that is manifested through the acts of racism and many other ways of discrimination. The strategy is to weaken the people by inflaming one against each other.
Who are we then? We are African people, working class heroes, students and scholars trying their best against a system built to set up obstacles for us to thrive. Lélia Gonzalez said at the African Heritage Studies Association in 1979 that in Brazil there is a racial division of labor, and it's not a coincidence Black people, also indigenous, are the most marginalized. It's a social project put to action to guarantee cheap labor force, and not only in Brazil, but all around the globe.
Connecting throughout the continent and creating a strong intellectual bond is the answer to change this reality. Opportunities will arise from encounters, projects, relationships. That's how it works for them and how it has to work for us. That's how the game has to be played, and we don't stand a chance if we ignore it or if we try to play it only for our personal success. And as nations of so many people, we can share the word of Abdias do Nascimento, very precise when it comes to destroy the idea of Quilombo we are trying to build here.
There is another condition of the African life that has never changed throughout the history of my people: our endurance against the oppression and our vitality and creative forces. We brought with us from Africa the strength of our spirit, of our social and political institutions, our religion, art, and culture. That's the essence of our concept of Quilombo.
We have our ancestry to guide us in this journey. However, we can only take it if we have the support from the community, from our brothers and sisters on the run, from institutions and government departments that can fund the changes we need to get done. Revolution is not gonna be local, it's gonna be global. Together we stand, divided we fall.
And I will just end by sharing this photo, which is the last day of the course. So it's me, Antonio on the left, Marcos on the bottom right, and the course participants. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. First, I would like to thank the Black Studies Collaboratory for providing me and other students with this opportunity, as well as my mentors, Nikki Jones, Eula Taylor, Janelle Scott, and Tiana Pichelle, who have supported me in reaching this stage of my research. My dissertation, Definition from Above, How White Philanthropy Shaped Black Public Education in the Early 20th Century, argues that philanthropies used education policy to prime Black youth for specific roles in the economy through teaching race and gender norms and skill sets. Working with the epistemologies of Black feminism, racial capitalism, and Black studies, my archival research uncovers the ways in which powerful white men philanthropists John D. Rockefeller and Julius Rosenwald used their fortunes to fundamentally shape the trajectory of Black public education. I focus on the 1890s through 1930s, a key period in which US philanthropic foundations emerged at the same time as the federal government abdicated its responsibility to provide a cohesive education system for Black students in the wake of the formal end of slavery. I used the funding from the BSC for a 2-week trip to the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. This archive allowed me to further explore a theme central to my research, public-private partnerships. Imani Perry points out that public-private partnerships were foundational to modern capitalism as European governments created the legal framework to protect the transatlantic slave trade. In studies of education philanthropy, public-private partnerships are often framed as a recent byproduct of neoliberalism, but my archival research explores the formation of these partnerships during the earliest period of Black public education in the United States. On this trip, I collected materials on the General Education Board, a group of elite white men led by John D. Rockefeller that in 1903 was given by the government sweeping powers similar to those held by the Department of Education today, including the, quote, construction of new schools and improvement of existing ones. During this trip, I was struck by the General Education Board's correspondence with Snow Hill Normal and Industrial Institute, a K-12 school founded in 1893 by Tuskegee graduate William James Edwards in his rural agricultural community in Wilcox County, Alabama. It was clear that the school relied on Northern funding to operate and that the General Education Board made key decisions that undermined local Black leadership. In the 1920s, they forced the school to become quote-unquote public, funneling future funding through the state of Alabama, leading directly to the school's eventual closure under the guise of desegregation and to the devastation of the local community. In May of this year, I traveled to Snow Hill and connected with some elders who were graduates of the school in order to deepen my understanding of the school's trajectory and relationship with the local community. I'll end there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wilson. I am currently undergrad in the Film and Media as well as Philosophy department. I'm really thankful for this opportunity from the BSC that allowed me to conduct my research for my senior thesis this past summer. So since the early 2000s, there has been an influx of African merchants, namely sub-Saharan African merchants, mainly from Tanzania, Nigeria, as well as Kenya, migrating to the southern part of China, namely a region called Guangzhou or Canton in knowing English. And while Chinese scholars have written extensively about foreign influxes or foreign immigrants into the Chinese society, really not much attention has been paid to what is happening right now, namely a current of exchange between developing countries, apart from the Euro-American paradigm of immigration. So I thought it would be fascinating to look into the community, namely the Xiaobei community in Guangzhou, which right now is heavily populated by sub-Saharan African merchants. So essentially, my project deploys a comparative analysis of the aesthetic representations of African merchants based in Guangzhou vis-a-vis their quotidian forms of practices through their labor and corporeality in order to bring out how the aesthetics and how the quotidian together affects the subject formation of the population. And through my ethnography in Guangzhou and analysis of 3 different media objects created by transnational artists who pay attention to the issue of immigration and commercial activities, I argue that aesthetic formalism and the material mediality itself has kind of fundamentally shifted the racial schematism in China ever since the early 2000s. Now, what is interesting with the rise of this phenomenon is actually since the early 2010s, voguing a historically Black practice, Black queer practice, has also been on the rise in China. And so my ethnography actually began looking at both parts, not only the Xiaobei community in Guangzhou, but also artists who are practicing voguing and drag in China. And soon I've realized that it is incredibly difficult to do so due to government regulations and censorships in many areas. I would often get informed about the event days after it happened, or I would simply not get informed about an event at all and show up and been told that the event has been canceled. And this happened to me many times, and throughout the process, on the other hand, throughout the process of trying to locate subjects to talk to in the Xiaobei community, I also faced a lot of obstacles, namely since the governmental crackdown since the 2013 and 2014, and during the COVID pandemic era, the African population in Guangzhou has faced essentially gentrification and expulsion and eviction from and deportation from the Chinese government. So through my study this summer, I've really come to notice two qualities that are important to the study of Black studies in China in particular, namely the elusiveness as well as fugitivity that are currently crucial to how not only African merchants conduct themselves in the commercial districts in Xiaobei, but also namely in their aesthetic representations, how they are often found in nocturnal times and also shielded by their quote-unquote Chinese facade partners. Yeah, so that's what I did this summer. Yeah, thank you.
They were right, the glare is really bad from here, so I will do my best. Hello everyone, my name is Xavier Durham. I'm a 6th year in the sociology department. Well, hello from the fraught department that it is. I'd like to thank BSC and particularly Tiana Fischel, who's been my advisor since I got here back in 2018, and I've always loved her kindness and guidance this entire time. My work is largely looking at the state of reentry in San Francisco because a lot of work that we see that it is because of the nature of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, there's this malicious interchangeability between like Blackness and carcerality a lot of the time. And so it's either if we talk about police, if we talk about prisons, jails, oftentimes we are going to be somehow finding ways to incorporate Black populations into these conversations and how racial domination plays out. But usually those spheres are separate. You have those who are being policed in the sense that people who are being policed in a lot of public spaces by a variety of different agencies, both at the federal and state level, and even local business owners and private security. And then there are those who might be unhoused or facing other forms of insecurity that are just trying to live and survive day by day. But there are organizations that are coming up that mark a convergence between these populations, one of which being this organization called Urban Alchemy, which operates in San Francisco and also exists in LA and expanded to a few other states and is looking to also expand into Canada. Urban Alchemy actually employs largely formerly incarcerated people into their program, which is super interesting because you think they are people who are still on probation, they're under carceral surveillance, they're still trying to deal with the fallout of trying to re-enter in society, so much so that they would say that re-entry is a farce for some people, because how can you be reintegrated into a society that was trying to kill you in the first place? Like, what does that actually mean? So I really wanted to understand how they can be both police and policed at the same time. Like, what is it to be in a policing role and then lay your head down in the same halfway house as someone that you told to get off the street earlier, or that you called San Francisco Police Department on, or if we go to Skid Row in LA, a very similar sort of collaboration with LAPD and sort of those organizational entanglements. So the funding was used to actually start interviewing employees who worked for this organization, or at least expanding out for a more comparative case, because because it is a bit fraught, not just because, of course, police themselves have a very interesting reputation with people who live in the Tenderloin and Skid Row, but also because Urban Alchemy is starting to come into the crosshairs as well, despite, again, being largely formerly incarcerated people, so much so that someone compared them to the paramilitary group that preceded the Nazis, in case you're wondering what brown shirts are. So doing these kinds of interviews and actually talking with them to see what is it like to have to deal with your own PO, to have to go to all these meetings, to like be under this constant bureaucratic surveillance, and then you turn around and then collaborate with the same people who are keeping their eyes on you in order to keep eyes on other people. Like, what does that actually do for you? So that's by and large what the project was focusing on, but I'm hoping to incorporate some ethnographic fieldwork as well to kind of see on the ground what is it like, because it's one thing to just talk to people about it, but in practice, it's probably a whole different story, and I want to see that in real time and make sure that I have a full sense of what might be going on, especially because Urban Alchemy only started in 2018, but their budget's already over 60 million. And that's more money than all of the reentry services in San Francisco has combined. So just something to sit on, hopefully not ominous. However, but thank you very much for the BSC for helping me to really get a head start on this project, and I'm excited to continue it.
So I'm interested for all of you in the course of doing the research with the grant that you received, what surprised you? How did your projects change or morph as you started doing the work?
Yeah, I can go first. I think what was most surprising for me in the process of putting together this course, I think initially I thought about the course as sort of very separate from the work I'm doing on my dissertation, which, or at least separate in a lot of ways from the work I'm doing on my dissertation, which is on the Black internationalism in the Portuguese-speaking world. And so obviously some connection, but I think very different. But as I began to really dive into building this course, and especially as we experienced the course together, I got to see some connections. Recently, someone asked me, what are the heart connections to my work? And I thought that was an excellent sort of avenue to begin to think about the connections. I think for me, building community across national, regional, linguistic borders and boundaries has always been really important, and to have had the opportunity to realize that this is another way that I can continue to do this and to understand its importance was really, I think, surprising and special to me, and to be able to do that, with this grant funding, which we used to create each of the courses. We created video modules, and so I don't know, in the video, you probably saw lots of people who looked like they were being interviewed. You didn't get to really hear the interviews, but you saw so the majority of the course was structured around these themes of Africanity, Quilombo, natural medicine, music, visual culture and painting, etc. And we used the funding to create these video modules, which will now live on in perpetuity. And so to be able to not only have done this once, but to have been able to support the Arakawa Institute and being able to continue to build these kinds of transnational communities. Yeah, thank you.
I applied for this funding when I was kind of in a phase after having done my prospectus, which is like our research proposal for the PhD dissertation. And I had finished the prospectus and was beginning to do archival research. And I think I kind of had an idea that I really wanted to make my project completely historical in focus, but I hadn't quite figured that out yet. So I would say doing this trip, as well as another archival trip I did last fall, really helped me solidify this pivot into really focusing in on the early 20th century. And I would say I learned that I actually really enjoy doing archival research and find it really compelling. And also just really digging into some different files where there was so much correspondence with certain schools, including this school, Snow Hill, that I was inspired to focus a whole chapter of my dissertation on the school, was something I was kind of hoping to find but didn't know what I would find. So that was very helpful for me.
I think I wouldn't have been able to conduct the ethnographical fieldwork without the support of this funding. And during my ethnography, actually, what was surprising was that how segregated the community was, even though there were local Chinese people living there. There were African merchants living there. There were more ethnic minorities living in the area from Xinjiang as well as Tibet. It was really difficult to essentially penetrate into any one of these communities. But because of the difficulty, I was actually, through my extended stay, to connect with several shop owners there to really hear their story of staying in the area for many, many years, or some of them even for more than a decade, and to kind of build this personal connection. And I wasn't expecting a lot of storytelling into my project initially, but I was able to incorporate that a lot of that actually, into my project, using it almost as a form of, an alternative form of literary analysis in my project. And yeah, so that was really exciting, and I still talk to those people, and they look like they're thriving. So yeah.
Even preceding the funding period, I had this very ambivalent relationship with time, because on like a positive note, like asking people like certain questions about how the organization had changed really gave me an insight as to both the pros and the cons of this particular model for employing formerly incarcerated people to do this kind of work, because I would learn that, okay, they actually started paying people $32 an hour like a year and a half ago. And I was like, that's impressive. But when I was doing interviews, they were getting paid $21 an hour. And then if you look on their website now, they're getting paid $17 an hour. So I'm like, how are they getting more money and paying people less? How does that work? But on the negative side, there would be like, oh, like we'll give you a tour of this place that we run and stuff like that, like the Tenderloin Center, which was like a very popular center for a lot of people in Civic Plaza because it gave them access to like safe drug use sites, places to store their clothes, take showers and stuff. And that got closed down not too long after I started talking to Urban Alchemy. So it was really like I had to make sure that I was staying on top of accessing these spaces because it really felt like so many things were fleeting even as they were expanding. But so I guess it really just instilled with me, go when you can, do when you can, because it may not be there with how volatile some of these models might be. And then, especially as the one of the founders is coming under controversy right now for apparently a lot of corrupt deals with Mayor London Breed, and like the more joking side things about her being another Rachel Dolezal, but that's another conversation. But yeah, time was definitely an interesting element that colored most of my work.
Thank you. Darius, I have a question for you that probably everybody else knows the answer to that I don't, but could you define what Amafricanity is?
Yeah, Africanity. So as I was saying earlier, the concept comes from the Black feminist Brazilian Leila Gonzalez, who she uses it as a concept to, in a lot of ways, I think, provincialize the United States, that African American sort of notion that that is the beginning and end of Blackness, right? And to actually, right, to talk about the Americas more broadly and the experiences of African descendant and indigenous folks in the Americas as a people with sort of, like I said, a shared, many shared cultural, political, linguistic practices that come from being defined as a people constructed by European, colonial domination and their resistance to that domination. Yeah.
So for each of you, could you talk a little bit about how you think your project and the work that you're doing is important or relevant to Black studies, or what the implications, the broader implications of it may be?
Yeah. Someone else like to start? I can start if you want, but.
I mean, yeah, let's reverse the order. I mean, for me, I think this is already like building on work from scholars like Dorothy Roberts and stuff about seeing how like what we'd understand as like welfare and these other forms of like support can in themselves become carceral. Like even though we're trying to lower the barriers for reentry, we're turning formerly incarcerated people into police. And so like there's still like this convergence of carcerality coming back in. So even if I see the ethos of organizations like Urban Alchemy trying to do something different, it's really kind of pushing not only these kinds of organizations, but also us in these academic spaces too, to think like, how do we not reproduce these same forms of domination, even when we have like the best intentions? because collaborating with state entities and like certain funders and stuff like that literally just puts us back into that same exact cycle. And so it's something that even challenges me with my work now. And actually, what Paulie brought up earlier, like right at the beginning of this whole like series, was really asking like, is this more than an intellectual pursuit? Like, what are the political stakes of this sort of work? Like, if the goal is to actually help populations who are trapped in these systems, like, what does this work do beyond just extracting their stories and just putting it in a cute little paper or a book and then keeping it going to the next project? But that's something that I've felt so just confused by, but like it's a positive confusion. It's something that I'm really, really excited for. And yeah, like it's not just like the welfare system or the penal state, like it's literally the labor market itself that is now turning over police people on each other now. And not just in like a more day-to-day, non-institutional sense of maybe they just won't associate with certain people because they don't want to be like surveilled by the police, but now they are directly working with the police. So it shows like this new era of how like security is consuming the exact same people that it's made to protect from in a lot of ways.
So in studying that phenomenon, do you feel like you're going to be moving towards maybe recommending practices or policies, or is it more just kind of dissecting how this is reproducing the security state in particular ways?
First, it's dissecting to see like what reach any policies I have in mind would actually like have, because even with like one of the papers that's coming out of this work, it does say like this is a political agenda, like this is what we need to do, but I'm still hesitant to say like it will actually pull us out of where we're currently at.
Thanks.
Yeah, so for me, believe it or not, Chinese people are very racist at times, even though we might not think that way often in the academic discourse here in the United States. But indeed, that is the case, and that is the internetscape, and that is reality in a lot of parts of China, namely even in parts that where quote-unquote locals are becoming more acquainted with African migrants. And I started noticing that phenomenon actually since I think during the pandemic when a person posted in their building's group chat, how about we eat the black man on the 7th floor? And that to me was astonishing to even read because it is beyond me. And that's what first drew my interest into looking at Black lives in China, because they actually constitute a quite predominant population, especially in Guangzhou, with Guangzhou being such a diverse city and transnational city on commercial trades. And I soon found out that people are not simply oblivious of the population, but there is a very specific form of racial schematism that have transformed, whether we can say, oh, it got transported from the Western Hemisphere, even though I don't believe that, or transformed through the modern digital age and digital economy into China, that fundamentally shifted how the Chinese people are thinking of racial relationships. And there's a simultaneous almost denial of, oh, these people don't really exist in our countries. They are a problem belonging to the United States of America, and only to the United States of America, which to me was very questionable, considering that I have actually had many encounters with African merchants back in China. And so that's what prompted me into studying this, and I'm losing track of the question because I'm talking so much. But yeah, and so I really wanted to see what seems to be absent or so elusive on the screen in media forms in China, whether it be film, whether it be video art, whether it be newspaper reports. What is truly going on. Like, not much literature has been produced on the African migrant population in Guangzhou since 2015. Yeah, so that was my sheer motive. I just wanted to see what is going on. Why is this racial schematism shaped like it is right now? Why is anti-Blackness sentiment so strong with the rise of right-wing nationalism in China? And yeah, looking at that through a critical Black studies perspective, namely Afro-pessimism, it really got me started into configuring this paradigm that's very much different from how people usually perceive African immigrants moving into Europe, moving into the United States. Yeah.
For my project, I entered into the PhD program in the Black Studies department here with an interest in contemporary philanthropy and the role of race and gender norms within education philanthropy today. And then going through our Black Studies education and our department really got me more interested in looking at this emergent history period in the turn of the 20th century when a lot of these policies were first formed. So I hope that I will still contribute kind of like guidelines or advice to philanthropies today eventually for how they can kind of reshape some of their funding programs to better support Black agency and Black world building. At the same time, I think this period really became clear to me as an important period to study. And it is a period that has been studied in terms of philanthropy geared toward Black students, more so in the education field, from a critical race and class perspective, but it's a topic that's been a lot less studied from an epistemology grounded in Black feminism and Black studies. So I'm hoping to contribute some new knowledge to the field and thinking through like how these initiatives were gendered, how these vocational schools were teaching differentially gendered programming, and then how that kind of connected to these philanthropists' visions for the economy and where they saw Black people fitting in with that.
Yeah, so I believe, I think many Black studies scholars have argued that we come from a long legacy, a long tradition of Black activists, scholars, artists who have formed bonds across and through language barriers in order to organize and to produce art and culture that has changed the world. And so I like to think that just this little mini course of mine was just a little drop in this bucket of this, centuries-long project. And in doing so, hope that, it inspires folks to take seriously and engage with intellectual traditions outside of the U.S., that it inspires translation projects that can bring some of those materials to English reading and speaking folks, and that it produces the kinds of collaborations that I really think Black study is all about. So, thank you.
Thank you. I actually kind of a little follow-up for you, Rachel. So I can kind of guess, but what would you say, give an example of one of the sort of racial gender norms you feel like this philanthropy is trying to inculcate in African-American students?
Mm-hmm. Well, so both of the philanthropies that I'm focusing on, which was the Rosenwald Foundation, funded by Julius Rosenwald, who is the CEO of the Sears department store, and then the General Education Board, which used John D. Rockefeller's fortune. Both of them required their schools to be, they both built a lot of Black schools in the South, or funded the building of a lot of Black schools. And they required those schools to be either vocational or industrial schools in order to access their funding. And so some of the ways I saw in the archive that those vocational programs or industrial programs would be gendered were like the General Education Board did a lot of agricultural work. And so they had like corn cobbing clubs for boys where they would teach boys different farming techniques, and then girls would be in like canning and like domestic sciences clubs where they would learn how to prepare those foods and kind of like take care of the home, with the idea that maybe they could be homemakers, which, you know, was not very realistic. But so I think it showed up in ways like that. And then just, I mean, the entire industrial and vocational training system was pretty much completely gender segregated. You know, training boys to work in factories and girls to do things like be, you know, care workers, domestic workers, and things like that.
Thanks. People have any questions you want to ask the panelists? Just we have a couple more minutes, I feel like.
I know everybody's shocked because we're not today. But we do. We actually do.
Thank you. Hi. I think this is a question for Rachel because I'm just interested. Have you looked at any policies? Because there's the Moral Act of 1890 that had every single state give 30 acres of land to develop historically black colleges and universities, and that is actually still upheld today, and that's what we see now called the extension system. And the only reason why I asked this is because I used to work for the extension system in Tennessee, and it's interesting to see how even funding and policy uphold some of those things that you're looking at, and maybe outside of the scope of your research, but I'm just curious if you have been looking into any policies that are still upheld today. And it's under the Farm Bill, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I am focusing my research on K through 12 education, so I'm not as familiar with the history of HBCUs. But I did become, so I would say no, not exactly, in terms of policies that were created that are still in effect today. I did become very interested in this period where the Freedmen's Bureau had been in operation, and the Freedmen's Bureau was basically an institution created by the federal government that was supposed to incorporate Black people after formal emancipation that lasted just a very short few years. And then when the Bureau was disbanded, that kind of created this power vacuum that allowed these wealthy white men to basically step in and decide how they were going to shape the newly forming Black public education in the South. So that definitely got me really interested in the time period I'm looking at. And then I think, you know, a concept that I've been thinking about, again, this is not exactly what you're asking, but a concept that I think is still really compelling from that period is W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of abolition democracy, and looking at how he was writing about this time period, looking at how what he termed as abolition democracy would be like kind of true abolition, in the sense that there would be a democracy with institutions robust enough to really support Black life and Black well-being. And so I do see my project as hopefully helping to think through like why we don't have abolition democracy, why it didn't happen in that period, and kind of how we could move more toward that. But yeah, I don't know if I have an exact answer to your question.
Tiana?
Thank you so much for this panel. I feel like I've seen most of these projects at different stages. I have a really specific question for you, Darius, which is if that picture of Angela Davis and Lelia Gonzalez is like, it was like they were together.
Yeah.
And if you could say more about that, if you know anything about them being together.
I wish I remembered the details. It's a photo I encountered online. They were together, and I can't say much more other than I know that for many, many years, Angela Davis has had a very strong affinity to Black feminist Brazilian activism and visits, very frequently and is, in deep conversation and solidarity with Brazilians. And so I use that image as a sort of remembrance and a reflection of the kind of work that I want to uplift and inspire for others. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just standing. I'm hoping, Wilson, that you might speculate a little bit about about the elusivity of what you didn't see and what you couldn't capture. And I'm curious because I think of, right, queer spaces is often, at least in the US context, as race mixing spaces often, right? And so do you imagine that you might that the events that you missed or found out about later or got canceled, might they have actually been spaces of integration, or just speculating, what might you have found and what did people sort of whisper about, what you didn't see?
Yeah, I guess talking more on the queer and drag side, actually, so the short answer is yes, it is a mixing space, at least from all the, I don't call them archival materials, but materials that I was able to pull from the internet of past events, especially clubs in Guangzhou. They were an extremely diversified population participating in the drag and voguing events there, and namely that the club would actually invite performers from outside of China to lead these events, and there would be participants from. So, sorry, little background about Guangzhou. Guangzhou, before the gentrification, actually had a lot of Russian population, and a lot of sub-Saharan African merchant population, as well as a lot of Middle Eastern population at the time. So it was a very heterogeneous city, and people become adapt to the cityscape of Guangzhou, namely that I know several people who are of the Islam religion, who are Muslim, actually drinking with their friends in bars, participating in events like these. So it's a very very fascinating scene of how people are changing how people are changing their lifestyles. People are making use of the best resources that they actually can find in Guangzhou. Now, that being said, that's the recreational space usage or entertainment space usage. On the other hand, the commercial space usage is actually, so one prominent mode of function in shops in Guangzhou is actually you would have several Chinese or at least Chinese passing people sitting at the front of the shop. And then the African merchants who are actually conducting the business sits in the back of the shop. So not to be seen most often, actually. Now, my theory is that this is a residual practice from the 2013 to 2015 crackdown, so that it would be easier for these merchants who have not obtained legal status to actually flee during police raids. But I have not done enough archival research on that to figure that out. But yeah, that's the phenomenon right now. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your presentations and sharing your work. Kind of just wanted to have a follow-up question for you, Wilson. In thinking about what Dr. Rayford just asked you, it made me think about, if you could reflect on, anti-Blackness in the Chinese context and what it means to think about this, right? You're talking on the one hand side about, Black American queer culture, right? And as we know, the desire to participate in or appropriate Black American culture is not necessarily a contradiction to racism, right, or to anti-Blackness. On the other hand side, you have African migrants, African merchants, in some cases undocumented, right? And so I'm curious, there can, on the one hand side, be a celebration and appreciation and a participation in some Black cultural forms, right, while rejecting Black people. And I think in particular, thinking about like Asia, from my East Asia in particular, in my experience, that's kind of always sort of been, especially when it comes to thinking about American culture and then thinking about Africans. And so I'm wondering kind of if any of this came up for you in thinking about the anti-Blackness that you sort of see and heard and were reflecting on. And I'm sure the COVID pandemic, I know in China there was a lot of kind of discursive sort of blaming of African migrants, even though there was no evidence for that. But just thinking about this too, right? There are also kind of times of moral panic and so forth, right? And when African migrants become scapegoated for a variety of social issues. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on kind of how these things fit together and what this means for anti-Blackness in China, for Black life in China.
Yes.
Would you explain Chinese passing people?
Oh, okay. I will answer the second question first. That's the easier side. But yes, essentially, due to the governmental crackdown during the pandemic and in the early 2010s, male-looking, East Asian male-looking people becomes essentially very dangerous to the African migrant community, because there would be Chinese undercover police who would actually walk on the street and then stop an African person or a Black person to check their passports or their legal documents. And oftentimes before the crackdown, there was a huge population of undocumented merchants in the Guangzhou area. So there established a kind of a very unstable relationship between the Black population in Guangzhou and East Asian-looking males, because they tend to be the undercover police in Guangzhou. So that's what I mean by Chinese passing population, namely those who look like me. Yes. And sorry, going back to the previous question. Yes, the short answer is actually that is where I started off thinking about is why is there such a discrepancy between the perception of the actual Black bodies in China and the historically Black practices, namely aesthetic practices in China. And now that is a very dense project that I don't think I have the even remotely close answer to. But doing a lot of historical and kind of circulation studies on news materials and etc., I think it does have to do with the deep association with the early arrivals of Africans in China, namely the discourse associated with them from the Chinese media regarding AIDS. So I think that was the very much the origin of kind of a anti-Blackness shaping in China. And it continued on because I don't know if y'all know this, but there are actually a lot of Confucius institutes in Africa, in different countries in Africa. And they actually had sent student populations from different countries in Africa to Chinese university to study. And with this initial discourse surrounding the contagious, what the discourse would call the contagious African bodies, the international students from Africa soon became the target population associated often. Not much different from the discourse surrounding African Americans actually in the early period regarding rape, regarding sexual harassment, regarding disease transmission, yes, so things like that. Now, I do think there's a slight I do think there's a difference between the American context and the Chinese context, and that is actually what I'm working on right now to figure that out. Yeah.
Well, thank you to all the panelists.